Welcome, everybody, back to the Nick Halaris Show. We are delving into a topic which is familiar for most of our regular listeners, which is the housing crisis in America. And our guest today is Laura Foote, who is the founder and executive director of Yimby Action and one of the most important voices of the entire sort of pro-housing movement in the country. Yimby Action is an innovative nonprofit that was started maybe a decade ago and has spread out across the country and has become quite a force in this battle for the future of American housing. So we're lucky to have Laura with us. Laura, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks. Very happy to be here. And it's under a decade. I'm glad that it's been less than 10 years still, because that means that we're growing fast and making progress. I think it's going to be very bittersweet when we hit that 10-year mark. I'm going to be like, I kind of didn't want to still be working on this problem after 10 years, but maybe that's a little overly ambitious that we were going to solve housing in America in 10 years, but maybe in the next 10 years. Yeah.
Maybe the next. Yeah. Like housing is a problem, maybe 40 years in the making. So
Yeah. Arguably 50 or 60, depending on, and also then you sort of ask the question, like, who has it been a problem for? It's been a problem for minorities and low income people for a really long time. And I think there's a really strong argument that we're all talking about it now because it's so bad for people who thought they were on an upward trajectory. White middle class people are finally being subjected to how horrific the housing market is. And now we're all talking about it. And I think we have to use that in order to actually change everything for everyone so that everyone has that opportunity to safe, stable housing. But I think you can trace the roots of this crisis back into racism and just decades where it's been really bad for a lot of people. Anyway, I'm interrupting you with my thoughts.
This is good. I think about this a lot because I talk to interesting people like you, and I'm actually in the business of producing housing in America, and so it's top of mind. But I sort of came of age actually too. Like I finished school right when the housing bubble was crazy. And so that was when George Bush was going on TV, President Bush was on TV talking about the ownership society and that they had finally solved it. And I think the home ownership rate had gotten close to 70 or maybe even gotten past 70, which is, the historical high actually in America. And so housing has sort of always been top of mind for me and our generation, and it's coming to a head. I feel like one of the things that's been fascinating to watch is the extent to which COVID has really woken people up about housing, because that everyone is like, oh, I actually want a house, and how do I go about getting one? And then they had their experiences, bidding wars and all that stuff. So it's a huge issue, obviously.
Yeah. I think COVID, the way I've seen it play out of the way people are thinking about it is there was this moment where people were thinking, oh, maybe I don't have to live near jobs and opportunity. I could go live someplace else. And then the fact that housing costs as much as it does isn't going to necessarily impact me as much because I can go live in the woods where it's cheaper than it is to live in these cities of high opportunity, lots of jobs. And that just hasn't really worked. You get out there and you're like, there's no walkability. There's not, there's no, there's a point. There's a reason why humans want to urbanize, right? Dense, vibrant, walkable communities are desirable, not just for the jobs and opportunity that are there, but also the jobs and opportunity and networking. Everyone's realizing that actually, just staring at your screen all day in the woods is not necessarily the lifestyle we want either. And that maybe it just shouldn't be so. Are we allowed to curse on your podcast?
Yeah, you can. You can.
Shouldn't be so fucking expensive. There's just no rational reason why a desirable place to live should be so fucking expensive.
Yeah, I know. It's a great point you make about this sort of remote work, the false promise of remote work. Prior to the pandemic, what I was thinking about a lot was that segregation had reared its ugly head again in a different form. And the form in the pre-COVID days, it probably still holds true today in my mind, was that it was essentially the geographic concentration of economic opportunity. And so if you really wanted to try to make it as a young person, you really did have to locate in one of these high cost jurisdictions, because that's where the big jobs were. That's where the tech companies were located. And if you wanted to, get your founders, your options or whatever you're trying to get to make it, you got to be in those places. And for a moment, it looked like that was going to change, but I think it's still true. What's your take on geographic concentration?
I mean, so we are more segregated by race today than we were 50 years ago. And I think, and especially by wealth, we are more segregated by wealth and income than we were 50 years ago. And I think that you say it's new, but I actually think it's important to really recognize that racism is exactly why we got here. That we had this moment where housing discrimination was declared illegal, and in America, we sort of woke up one day and, okay, you're not allowed to discriminate by race anymore across the entire country. And communities didn't wake up that morning and say, oh gosh, I don't want to discriminate anymore. They woke up that morning and said, we have to figure out a different way to discriminate. We're not going to be able to just say no Black people are allowed in this community. And that's when you get the invention of zoning. That's when you get people down zoning and saying, well, if we can't discriminate explicitly based on race, we can block the kind of housing that lower income and browner people are going to be more likely to live in. And so you see this mass downzoning take fire across the country, blocking apartment buildings and saying we're only going to have single family homes, and we're going to sort of freeze communities in amber as much as possible. And that sort of took fire throughout the 70s. Really, you see this like massive downzoning across the US on purpose. In a lot of places you can see like the veiled racism wasn't so veiled, right? You would see people saying we have to now they say preserve our community, and you're like, what does that mean? They're just talking about the buildings, right? But this kind of mass downzoning, which was an explicit there's that book about draining the public pool, right? The idea that when we were going to potentially be allowing different people into our communities, that's the time to make sure we restrict our communities even more and block people from moving in. And that then eventually the snake eats its tail, and you start to see that this impoverishes their own children, because now that you've blocked low income people and people of color from moving into the school district, which was like the primary driver, right? We don't want to integrate our schools, and so we're going to block people from moving into our community. Then you end up with my kids also can't afford to live here. That's the decades later, the snake eats its tail, and you've impoverished the entire community by blocking housing production for decades and driving up the cost in these, which started out as like semi-exclusionary suburbs. Now they're like unbelievably ungodly expensive suburbs that because they've just denied housing for decades. And there was a little moment there where we were doing more and more sprawl development, and that kind of kept housing from being as crazy expensive as it could have been. And now we're doing less and less sprawl development, which is good. We should not pave over the earth in single family homes. Like I think green places are good, but we didn't then also decide to densify our existing suburbs. We didn't decide to densify our existing cities. And so, everybody's just getting the squeeze, just prices. It's like there's this net that's holding back housing production. And in places where there's jobs and opportunity, you see the economy pushing up against that net and people suffering, people getting pushed down into poverty, people getting pushed down into homelessness, people getting pushed into mega commuting and overcrowded conditions, all of these things because there's this net holding back housing production that really, it's important to recognize, was built because people did not want to share their communities and continue to not want to share their communities.
Yeah, it's a great point. And, I listen to some of your public comments that are on the internet and related to them, because I had attended in my neighborhood meetings around proposed projects. And what's sad but enlightening, because it helps you understand like the scale of the problem, is that the racism thing is still a huge issue. And what's crazy about it now is that you have people who sort of on paper are not racist, right? Like they're probably members of the Democratic Party. They openly support anti-racism in their sort of public life. And yet they show up to this meeting and are arguing essentially racist. Maybe you could argue that it's a classist argument, like, hey, I don't want poor people living in my neighborhood. But there's some like, at the
Which is
very
not
least,
like
yeah,
it's racism is not better than
not
racism.
better. Yeah, it's not better. It's true. Yeah.
Yeah, I know, but there is this like, you know, so my phone number is kind of like on the internet. Don't go look for it, people, okay? But like it is kind of out there sometimes, which means like I get calls. And so I got this call yesterday from this woman who was very mad that they were using a bill that we had supported to build some housing in her area. And she wanted me to help her figure out how to block it. And I was like, you are calling the wrong person.
That's
Um,
interesting.
and I was like, she was one of the things she talked about was that she was worried that like the road wasn't wide enough for the fire truck. And I was like, well, this new building is going to have new taxpayers in it who are going to help you pay for modern fire trucks that it can be smaller and nimbler and make those turns. And she was like, well, some of them aren't taxpayers. Some of them are, because some percentage of this project is low income, which I'm for. But, and I was like, oh, please finish that sentence.
Yeah.
But, that's kind of like this mental game people get into with themselves where they realize that their desires are at odds with their stated values. And like the hoops they go through in their mental gymnastics are just crazy when they try to figure out how to justify what is like an appalling position to be like, I don't want to make my community more accessible. Like it is kind of an appalling position. It's very understandable and human, but it's like not a good thing that we should nurture in society.
No, it's not, and it's disturbing that the frequency with which it manifests. It's not just like a California thing. Like I've attempted to do some projects in Georgia, for example, and I have friends in Tennessee, which is like supposedly a pro growth state, and it is the exact same public meeting all across the country. People
And no
coming.
matter what, like purple, red, blue, it's all the same. You could
Yeah,
just cut and paste everybody's public comments from one place
yeah,
to the next.
yeah. It's wild. Well, I want to get into Yimby Action because it's such a innovative and such a big force. But before we do that, I want to hear your origin story. Like, how did housing become the thing you focused on? Tell me that.
Yeah, so I moved to San Francisco because my husband at the time got a job here. And I was really struggling. I couldn't sort of get my act together and figure out what my, next job. And so all of my friends when I was here, just moved here, were like worked at coffee shops and in food service and were really struggling, and now I have all these words for it. Like I had a friend who was living with a hoarder, right? And we would say like living in substandard conditions. I had a friend who was living with an ex who was getting increasingly erratic. I had a friend who was living in now I can say it's an unpermitted ADU, right? This is they were living in a basement that hadn't been converted really into housing, and as I was sort of realizing that like this housing shortage thing was manifesting, all of these stories were housing stories. You know, my mother was like, well, they're 30 and they're going through this. And I was like, yeah, it's not that. And so many of the stories they were telling themselves were ones of personal failure. It wasn't, sometimes we would talk about how high the rent was, but often it was through the lens of personal failure that they had not, and especially the ethos of, but this is the ethos of all cities, but ethos of San Francisco, which was, come here, make a lot of money, which is just like, you would have to make, nobody who's working in food service is going to be making enough money to really be able to afford a normal apartment. And it really just, I got a letter in the mail from a nearby homeowner who was very upset. They had blanketed the entire neighborhood in flyers. They were very upset that someone was going to take a 1-unit, 1-story building and turn it into a 2-story 2-unit building, and they were enraged. And I was like, this is why I don't have a good apartment. And so I went over to the door of the person who was trying to build the 2-unit building, and I was like, so I hate these people. What can I do to help you? And they nearly broke down into tears. They were like, this has been such a like awful war with my neighbors. And they were an architect couple. They happened to know, we got all introduced to people of, you guys get mad about the same things. And it turns out it was like a lot of women. So Sonia Traus, Annie Fryman, me, there were like a lot of women who were sort of like, okay, this is a political issue. And when I started showing up at city council meetings in San Francisco, we call it the Board of Supervisors, it was really weird how nobody was talking about there being a housing shortage. Like sometimes they would say there was an affordability crisis, but the idea that we had a housing shortage was controversial. It was, we were all accused of having all kinds of bad morals. We were shills for this. And I was like, no, this is like a scientific fact that we have a housing shortage. Like, I'm not shilling for anybody by like admitting that rain is wet. Like I'm not like here for big rain. I'm like, the housing shortage is very evident, which then made us realize that there was no organized constituency, right? In order to have a politician care what you think, in order to have the politician will say that rain is dry so long as there is a constituency saying, I demand that you say rain is dry. Politicians get to the heads of parades. We needed to form a parade. And so, kind of spiraled out of control from there of having meetups and, kind of making it the cool thing to do to go give public comment, right? I love that you were like, oh, I watched your public comment on YouTube. And I'm like, yes, like we need to make it hip to go give public comment. Like that is kind of, unfortunately, the solution is that we have to deeply engage in a system that is deeply flawed and biased against young people, against working people, against low income people in order to change that system.
Yeah. What was it, the time from when you had this sort of wake up related to the house that turned into a duplex and when Yimby Action became a thing?
Yeah, so it would be like 2014, 2015 is when we all started getting more organized. And then into 2016, we helped get state Senator Scott Wiener elected. That was like our big election, which, we were all working on local issues and it was really great. And then meanwhile, Trump gets elected, which was really traumatic. But that growth into that 2016 election was really critical for us being like, okay, we can make a big impact here. We can actually like be a mobilized constituents. We organized more than 200 people out canvassing, which in politics, in local politics, getting 200 people to go door knocking was huge. And really tipped the balance, arguably, in that race because it was such a tight election.
I didn't realize that he was winning on such thin margins. I thought he had. Is it still the same? Is he still like at risk of losing his seat in every election?
No, once you're an incumbent and and you sort of like get a track record and whatnot, it's very hard to take down the incumbent. But it was an open seat, and in all cities, really, it's Democrat versus Democrat, so it's really hard to differentiate the candidates. It's even worse. Like, you think the federal is vibes-based politics, like local can be. There are more organized constituencies, but there's so much vibes-based stuff because people don't necessarily know what the local issues that candidate can have a lot of impact in. Most people are not organized these days. They don't track local politics. If you ask somebody who's your mayor, who's your city council member, most people can't answer that question. And so, these races it's such a small electorate of people who vote that far down ballot that you don't need a lot of people to engage all of these less educated voters to then make a really big difference in these elections. I hope that's inspiring for people who are like, it's so the barrier to entry in local politics is not there. Like, you can go tomorrow and like figure out who you're, go chat with your local city council members and ask them what are their positions on housing. And, they feel like they have to answer you. Like it's a one-to-one. I can't call Joe Biden and be like, what's your position on this? But you can call your city council members and be like, I want to know what your position is on these. And they'll write back to your emails generally.
Yeah. I think that's such a good point. Like I had on Leonora Kamner from Abundant Housing and now Climate Safe Villages, and we were talking about this exact issue of the extent to which the housing crisis and sort of the politics of housing crisis are actually a function of a failure in the democratic processes, because so few people are engaged in these local politics issues. The politicians respond to whoever's in front of them with even a small parade. Like you mentioned, I like that analogy you use, but even a small parade of NIMBYs has been enough to convince these board of supervisor members in San Francisco or city council members in LA to just kill projects.
All the time. I mean, when you poll people and say, general public, are you pro housing or anti housing? Sometimes it's close, but generally people are much more pro housing when you poll them than the elected officials. We say realize, but actually the elected official currently isn't totally wrong often, because the number of people who are voting is so small. The number of people who are tracking what they do is so small that they are catering to an audience of NIMBYs who are hyper engaged. I mean, local politics has just been besieged by the hyper engaged person who's sending them, the mean email all the time. How dare you? You better not. We need you to stand up for our community and block this project. And that hyper engaged person is getting, so much more, just massively disproportionate amount of attention from our local government than the average person. And the average person is like angry the government doesn't care about them, but like, you got to care about government too, right? We need, and that's what Yimby Action, like we're training people to go care about your government. Like I can't do it for you. You have to do it because you're the constituent in that place who can actually get your elected official to care about this issue.
Yeah. So this is a good time to get into Yimby Action. So Yimby Action came to being, and what? Give me a summary of all the different things y'all are focused on, and the scope. Like, if my understanding is now Yimby Action is spread across the country, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I get to take credit for like a lot of what, no, I'm just kidding. But what we do is really focus on propping up and helping. It's like, what do I wish somebody had done for me when I was just getting started? And so we help people form local chapters and get involved in their local community. And eventually that ladders up to engaging on state legislation and all, everything from project by project advocacy, doing endorsements and getting the right people elected, engaging in local, both legislation. And then there's like, housing element land use adoption policies, right? It's like getting people comfortable with that level of wonkiness. And so we are really, we're creating this community. We're creating toolkits for chapters to pop up and really hit the ground running so that they don't run into the kind of like problems of like, oh God, there's all this stupid stuff when you're starting to get organized of like, our email list lives on a Google Doc and then I can't get it out of MailChimp. Don't use MailChimp. I mean, if you need to use MailChimp, but like, and then like somebody creates a one cause account and you can't get, it's just like all of that headache. We're like, okay, what if we bundle up the tech for you so that you don't have to worry about that part? We have an integrated membership system. And that allows local volunteers to just like hit the ground running and be like, okay, here's a project in our area we care about. We can quickly create a petition, get more people signed up into our list, have a happy hour, get people excited, do an endorsement process that doesn't make us tear our hair out so that we get better people elected. And like the coaching, right? I'm here to be like, yes, go canvas for those candidates, and make it cool and fun. And here are your stickers. People love stickers, How do we almost gamify it, but like make there be a vibrant community of activists so that people keep trying to improve on this issue. So now we have chapters, we have like 3 in Florida. I don't know anything about Florida. Like, I know it's a state, but they are making progress in Orlando, like making housing a hot issue in Tampa. And I'm like, I don't know anything about the politics of Tampa, but I do know the politics of organizing. And I do know that, like, to this point of like the NIMBYs are the same everywhere. Actually, like, organizing is kind of the same everywhere. You have to form that parade. You have to get people excited. You have to get people wanting to be part of your community and keep showing up and keep giving public comment. Like, one hot public comment is great, but it does not make the difference, because those NIMBYs are going to show up week after week after week after week. And so we have to have, like, we're running a marathon. We have to keep engaging and show that there is a political bloc there that will vote you into office if you are pro housing. We're not fair weather friends. We're not going to be, it's I love TikTok, but like, TikTok is not, there's this great quote recently. Somebody was like, are you trying to make a point, or are you trying to make a difference? And what is the difference between trying to make a point and trying to make a difference? You have to be running the marathon if you want to make a difference. You can make a point and go viral, but that is not what's going to change this issue over the long haul. Like, we need to actually, like, pass legislation.
Yeah, you got to pass legislation, and you have to help these if you really want to make a difference, you have to help the pro housing candidates win. Because what happens a lot of times is that the people that are sort of against progress, they just wait you out. And because
Yeah.
it's in their interest. So they'll listen to you, and then the same person will get elected, and they'll block all your projects. And that's why you got to see it through. You have to actually do the hard work, which Yimby Action does. So Yimby Action does endorsements, so political work, helps people develop campaigns for project specific advocacy, right? So like if there's like the duplex project needs
Right.
support from the community, the chapter will help galvanize support for that and bring people to the hearings and whatnot. What else does your side of Yimby Action do?
Yeah, it's really, I mean, it's important to sort of think of it as like a toolkit for activists, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's whatever makes sense in their area. So sometimes, it's like stuff that, I don't know, your podcast people, I mean, maybe you have a wonky enough audience. It's like general plan adoption. Like, I swear, we make general plan adoptions cool and fun, right?
Yep.
And there's a lot of processes that your local government's going through of implementation that is kind of deliberately complicated. And the NIMBYs have historically thrived in this environment where the planning departments are, trying to, like, be thorough and answer everyone's questions. But that just means you have these incredibly complex documents that didn't need to be that complex. We don't need to be as prescriptive in our land use about how far the setbacks need to be from the road. We have incredibly prescriptive because they're trying to address every concern that a NIMBY might have when doing these general plans of what is allowed locally. Well, we need to get in there, and when they're having these conversations and they're meeting with quote unquote the public, I'm like, what sane person has ever shown up and had a really passionate opinion about setbacks? Like, there's just not a person who
Yeah.
if you, like, I mean, I'm sure you have a passionate opinion about setbacks. I have formed unwillingly a passionate opinion about setbacks, but like, most people be like, setback from what? What are you talking about? And like, so the public that they're so you have to, like, get into these nitty gritty, like, wherever your government thinks that it's having a conversation with people, we have to be showing up and paying attention. And so, like, part of our sort of, like, what are we doing, right? It's like, California has this huge process where they have big housing goals every year that local cities are supposed to try to achieve. It's called the housing element process. And the local government has to adopt what's supposed to be a credible plan to achieve those goals. And so we're sending our people in to go say, is this plan credible? If not, yeah, and you have to read these, like, 50, 100, 200-page documents. What parts of this are nonsense? Tattle on them to the state agency to say, please knock this plan out. And then, fun part, we also do lawsuits. So where local governments are breaking the law, either denying individual projects or in this like housing element process or what have you. Sonia Traus runs our Yimby Law Division, and so we're also so an individual project, right? It's kind of fun for a chapter, right? An individual project happens in their area. We have to establish standing, so we come in and we give public comment and we support that project, and then maybe it comes down to a lawsuit, and so we as members also get to engage with that lawsuit and show that like this project is going to impact people in a positive way, right? These are local people who care about the opportunity for more housing in their area. And that really does impact these lawsuits that I don't want to say inevitably, but currently it's really important to have the ability to threaten lawsuits and to be able to sue, and have this sort of holistic way of doing politics that we are engaging at every level.
Yeah.
That was a long answer. Sorry.
No, it was a great answer. There's a couple follow up points on the lawsuit front. I think it'd probably be good to just talk about this for the audience. Like historically, the game in California was essentially being dominated by the NIMBYs because they were using the CEQA Act, which is this landmark environmental legislation passed in California that gave sort of private citizens a cause of action to prevent projects from going forward that may or may not have environmental concerns. So for decades, that was going on. And in recent times, I don't really know the exact history, but in recent times, because the state legislature has been pro housing and the state government has been relatively pro housing compared to the cities, they've been passing these other laws that have given the ability for the Yimbys to fight back and file lawsuits in support or lawsuits to help developments go through. And that's a relatively new toolkit to the arsenal, right? Like that's maybe a decade old or something like that.
It's, I would say that there have always been more grounds for pro housing lawsuits, but the only people who are willing to do them, like the Housing Accountability Act is the one that a lot of our lawsuits are based on. I'm not even going to explain what that is. I mean, the Housing Accountability Act is one of these laws. Actually, I am, because it's such a stupid law. You have to follow your own rules. And you're like, how can there be a law that says you have to follow the law? But there is. There's a law that says cities have to follow their own rules. They can't just be totally arbitrary. And why did we need a law like that written? Because cities are totally arbitrary and don't follow their own laws. And constantly we're disallowing projects on no grounds, random, they just fill in the blank. Like, it's Tuesday, I didn't feel like approving this project. So it's actually, most of our lawsuits aren't really CEQA based. You know what? Too complicated. But the point is that local developers were very hesitant, and still are extremely hesitant, to actually go down the lawsuit run, because there's so many different places where the city can jam you up. And so, I mean, especially affordable, nonprofit subsidized affordable housing developers, they're the most gun shy. They will not, push back in any way on the nonsense that cities will do to say no to these projects. And as soon as you say, actually, under the law, you don't have the right to disallow this project, most of our potential lawsuits don't even result in lawsuits. We just have to send one threatening letter that's like, hey, the law's very clear. We will sue you if you don't allow this project. And, a lot of projects then suddenly magically get approved. And I think that the shift that happened 10 years ago and is us coming in as people who don't have skin in the game, except for the general need for housing, being able to say, okay, we will sue you. The developer won't sue you because he is afraid of you, but we are not afraid of you. We have no financial interest in this. And so we're very happy to sue you and make sure that this housing gets built. It's been very powerful.
Yeah, super. It's and it's spreading. Like it's too to use your word, too wonky to get into it, but these offensive measures, legal measures, are spreading and they're being used, and this housing element that you mentioned, people are using it to force jurisdictions like Beverly Hills to try to
Yeah.
actually build some apartments, which is interesting. You mentioned something earlier that I don't want to forget to bring up, because I think it's a really important point for this whole housing discussion, which is you mentioned that many of these things where policy decisions are being made or heard are deliberately confusing. And
Mm,
I had never really thought of it that way, but I think you're right. Like, even the whole process for updating like the zoning for a neighborhood in LA or San Francisco, they're using these like really wonky terms, and it almost doesn't even signal like, hey, this is going to change, this is relates to the future of your neighborhood. It's like, hey, this is the house, the zoning element update for the West Hollywood neighborhood community district A, and then who's going to
yeah.
show up to that meeting?
Right. Who's going to that meeting? You'd
Yeah,
have to pay me to show up to that meeting,
yeah,
Yeah. Which is why I kind of almost do understand everyone when, we were first getting active, they were like, they must be getting paid. And I was like, I should have been paid. Like these meetings are 6 hours of like obscure land use
yeah,
nonsense
yeah,
that once you realize is determining the future of your community and is you're sort of like it's the most boring ladder being pulled up of opportunity, like no, 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 you're not going to get this. And like, but you have to like make yourself sit there and watch grass grow
yeah,
and realize that this is determining the future of your community.
yeah.
um, and I do think like this is where I'm like the um, it's so important that we foster this community of activists and cheer each other on and recognize this is really important. There's something that it's just so easy to be, when one pro housing person shows up, it's so easy to get like, oh, like I just showed up in this morass and there's nobody here. And like when I spoke, I can't tell you how many meetings I've been at where somebody booed or hissed, right? It's like a very hostile, they believe that they are righteous. And so the anti housing people can be very cruel and it's just can be very awful. And if you don't foster a community of pro housing people, it can be very demoralizing because it's both dry and hostile. And without like, we have a little Slack, right? All of our members, if you're a Yimby Action member, you can join the NIMBY Action Slack, and just being able to chat, being like, I'm at this terrible community meeting, and have somebody be like, yay, we support you. Like,
Yeah,
good job. Like, tell us what's happening. Like, that just like changes the dynamics so much.
totally. How many members do you guys have
I think we're like 3,000 right now.
in California or nationwide?
That's nationwide.
Okay.
Which goes to show you don't really need that many people. And we have those are people who are like paying membership dues, taking active membership. Then we have, I think it's like 15,000 more people on our mailing list.
Hmm.
So those are people who are taking some action, right? We don't buy lists or anything. So you have to have like done something, come to an event,
Yeah.
done something active to get on our list. And like that's really the sort of broader community of people who are taking action at any time. Um, but also the Slack is such a useful organizing tool for people pepping each other up, especially now that Twitter is dying the final death, right? People used to get on Twitter and
Yeah.
live tweet hearings, which is really fun. And I don't know, maybe they'll thread them these days.
I know. I'm not sure what's happening on Twitter, but the content's definitely changed. Like, I get less like relevant. It's mostly like weird videos and stuff. Like, I'm not exactly sure, but um, I know we're running short on time, and I have several more important questions. I love what you have done with Yimby Action, and I really feel like you've created a force for good in the world, and super supportive of that. And wish you continued success in that effort. And I wanted to get your take before we sign off on a couple things. The first one is like kind of a thought experiment. Imagine for a second if you were dictator of California and you were given the ability to put in place policies to fix the housing crisis, what would you do?
So, this is the one that kind of, for some people, freaks them out, but I'm like, Japan makes their land use decisions at basically a national level. And I think that that's the direction we should go. California, maybe you could sort of make them at state by state levels. But the whole point is that we should not be making project by project decisions. Project by project decisions. It's like saying, are we going to take a poll every time somebody wants to open a coffee shop in your neighborhood? That doesn't really make sense. And we need to have universal rules that are applied the same every time of, are we going to say yes or no? This is often called over-the-counter permitting, by right permitting. The rules are the rules. If you follow the rules, you get your permits. And those rules need to be much more flexible and need to be, much less prescriptive. I think often even when people say by right permitting, they might even still be quite prescriptive. We need to have very form-based zoning is something people say, where you basically say, here's the box that you can put whatever kind of building you want into. I think we need to have higher health and safety standards. I think that right now we use health and safety as like a proxy, but our existing housing stock does not get investigated for health and safety pretty much at all. And so we're doing all this focus on the health and safety of new housing, and you're really like squeezing blood from a stone. Our modern housing stock is quite safe. It's, our fire requirements are quite high, but our old housing, as somebody who lives in old housing and is going around with my little lead sticks testing everything, nobody is testing our older housing stock. I mean, if we were sort of saying what would bring up lifestyles for people, I think more investigation of our older housing stock to bring up the quality of the housing that we're going to keep around, but also form-based zoning. Really, we should, I think, maybe have like two kinds of zoning. Do we allow housing here or not? And if we're going to allow housing here, then allow any kind of housing. All of our favorite cities, all of our favorite places were built before the idea of zoning was even invented. There's just no reason. I mean, I think people are like, oh, what if you put a 15-story apartment building next to a single family home? And you can walk around a city like San Francisco and see that all over the place. And it's actually like beautiful. It's not, I think people are like shocked that the Painted Ladies are right next to a giant apartment building. The most famous, beautiful single family homes in San Francisco have a big honkin' apartment building right next to them. And people do not arrive on the site and clutch their pearls and say, oh my, that terrible, huge apartment building is casting a shadow. Like, they're just like, oh, it's a beautiful day at the park. And they go on with their lives. So I think, the technical terms are form-based zoning and, by right permitting. But I think of really the sort of maximal expansive vision of that, where we really say, are we allowing housing here or are we not allowing housing? Are we going to have truly green space? Are we going to have an urban growth boundary where we really don't allow anything? Single family home only zoning is a mandatory sprawl zone. Like, that is what it is. Single family home only zoning is saying this is where the sprawl will go. And it's just a bad thing. We shouldn't want sprawl. We should densify our existing suburbs so that they turn into vibrant towns. We used to have this thing called towns. It had like a whole life there. Imagine if your suburb had enough people that it could support a coffee shop and a little diner, and you didn't have to drive 2 hours to a shitty strip mall. It's just like all of our favorite places were built when we didn't segregate by use, when we didn't have single family home only zoning, and we just need to go back to letting people build things.
I love that answer. All right, two more questions. When you think about your future, what's the contribution you're trying to make to the world?
I mean, I would be happy if we really solve this problem. I don't think I'm going to be happy if we don't solve it because it's so self-inflicted. The only thing that is keeping us from having more diverse communities, from having affordable communities, from having walkable, vibrant places that people actually want to live. The only thing that's keeping us from having that is a few words we have written in zoning books that nobody wants to read anyway. It's such a self-inflicted problem. And there are like global warming. I don't have a total solution for that one, right? We're going to have to invent new things. We're going to have to figure things. A lot of that is legal as well, but zoning is so self-imposed, and we could just not do this to ourselves anymore. So, I mean, I do think that um, I would love to be starting to work on something else in a few years because we just solved this one. If we make our communities, 20% more affordable, I will have to be accepting of that, because that would be a pretty big contribution. But um, what if no one was spending more than 30% of their income on housing costs forever? I think that would just be a lovely society we could live in.
Yeah, and it would provide the foundation for sort of a long term America, right? Like
Oh,
the question in my mind, the reason why housing is important, in addition to sort of the daily life of American families, is that it's unclear to me whether you can have a democracy, a superpower democracy, where there's such stratification of wealth, and in this country that means housing. Like if you look at the numbers, like you're going to make it or not based upon whether you own a house, and so it's a huge issue. There's no doubt about it.
I I don't know if this is too far to take it, but I do think that a great amount of the underlying bitterness that has crept into our society and our politics, and that is expressing itself largely at the national level, this deep bitterness people have about lack of opportunity, about someone taking something from them, about being just sort of generally angry about the trajectory of your life, which expresses itself a lot in the rural communities, but is very deep in it's just across the US. And a huge amount of that is housing costs and the lack of opportunity that comes along with housing costs being what they are, that you cannot get your feet under you. I think it's also driven up the cost of other core pieces, that when we look at like core inflation, right? Housing costs are a huge driver of this underlying problem in the economy. And then the second piece of education being as expensive as it is. Why is education so expensive and so out of reach for so many people? Why aren't we sending twice as many, three times as many, 10 times as many people to higher education and whatnot? It's also because part of the NIMBYism is this town on gown war, that we have squeezed our colleges and our education systems so that they have also become luxury goods. Our housing has become a luxury good, and our education system has become a luxury good, where a city does not allow, and I have family in a town in Maine, and they constantly talk about making sure that the local college that's it's a educational, it's Merchant Marines, that the college doesn't grow, doesn't encroach, is what they often say, encroach on the town. And it's like, well, you could have, but if they had been encroaching, that little college could have grown 3 or 4 times as now. And the amount of opportunity lost by that quiet war taking place on our future is almost incalculable. This desire for those that have, to say we will not allow anyone else in this community to grow or thrive, that what we have now is beautiful and we will maintain, but we will not allow growth. The cost of that is so invisible to those people who think that they're holding on to something. The cost of that holding on, that death grip, has been our futures. We have lost so many opportunities because of that death grip.
Yeah. I think you're so right too about this being at the core of the underlying cause of the the bitterness in American politics, because it's difficult to admit this, especially once you become adult. But housing insecurity is up there in the top things that you could be insecure about as an adult, because it's core. It's like your daily existence. And our parents were sold a dream of home ownership, as were every other generation of Americans in recorded history. And now we're asking our young people to either defer their dream or maybe never participate. Like, oh, you could be a renter for life. You could be a co-living resident. But the truth is, what Americans want is they want a chance. That's what this country's about: the chance to make it, to be an owner, to own a piece of it. And this is out of reach. It's out of reach because of these failures, like you said.
I will say that when we get to the magic place on the other side, right? Home ownership does not have to be the only way that Americans generate wealth in this country, right? But because we've tied middle class wealth and home ownership so deeply together in this country, the fact that we have then made home ownership out of reach for so many means that any form of intergenerational wealth for the middle class has been decapitated. I mean, it's like we have just cut that access off. And there are two paths there, right? We could say, what is going to be the way that middle class people generate wealth? And we can detach housing from that and have abundant housing. And this is the sort of like controversial thing of like, if we made housing really, really affordable and we made it easy to generate intergenerational wealth through some other thing, I don't want to become a homeowner. I don't like the idea of having to know what a water heater actually does. I like being able to call someone else when something goes wrong. This is like it, but the fact that my sort of like mild preferences for not being a homeowner are good for me, because I'm never going to fucking be a homeowner. It's out of reach for me now, but it also means like, what is the way that I'm going to be, my money is just being burned in an incinerator renting, because we have no way really for me to sort of have a general way to establish savings. Like we make home ownership tied up with savings for that intergenerational wealth. And I don't have any assets, right? My mother at this age had assets she could leverage into other assets. We're on these two different trajectories now that I do not have assets. I have assets in my lovely family, but I have no assets. And, that's a really different life that our generations are just bifurcating on. And we can solve that different ways, but having housing eat up your wealth forever and ever is definitely not going to solve it.
Yeah, it's not going to be good for America. There's no question about it. Okay, last questions. I know you've got
Right.
to go.
Yeah.
What's something that listeners can do if they want to help you in your mission?
Well, become a member, yimbyaction.org/join, and we'll match make you if there's a chapter active in your area. That's the easiest thing to do, yimbyaction.org/join. And also, this is then the next steps, and start paying attention to your local politics. Promise to yourself you're going to learn who all the members of your city council are, learn who your state representatives are, and become a more engaged person. There is a lot that you can then do from there. I hope that when we send you an email being like, there's a project in your neighborhood, you come and support. But just that act of figuring out what's happening in local politics. I also want to do a pitch. if I think most millennials are kind of lonely. There's a whole community of people engaged in local politics that once you start picking at that thread, start going to events, start realizing who's active and what's happening in your community, it's a fantastic way to meet people and find out more about what's happening in your area, is to just start pulling at that thread of local politics, and learning who your city council members are and what's happening, and shifting how they think about who lives in their community is the most powerful thing you can do.
Let's love that answer as well. Thank you, Laura. This has been a super fun conversation. Thank you for taking time out of your day to come on the show and share these ideas and share your passion for, trying to in it. You've got a bold vision. You want to actually solve this thing. Some people are content with these little wins, but I'm with you. Like, you got to go all the way. Otherwise,
No way. What's the point?
the NIMBYs will continue to win. So, yeah, thank you for being here, and look
Thank
forward to
you.
staying in
It was
touch.
great.